Welcome to the Inner Essence, a space of mindfulness, spiritual awakening, and reconnecting with your true self. Breath, be present, and begin your journey with it.
You catch your reflection in a window, and for a split second it feels alive. Then the thought arrives, that's me. And in that instant, something vanishes. The warmth, the presence, the quiet pulse of being, gone, replaced by a concept. Why does that happen? Why does reality seem to hide the moment you try to understand it? Maybe the universe isn't resisting you at all. Maybe it retreats only when you force it to explain itself. What would happen if just once you stopped trying to understand and simply saw? There's a subtle instant, barely perceptible, when awareness turns into analysis. You've felt it. 1 second you're inside an experience, breathing its texture, and the next you're standing outside it, naming, labeling, measuring. The mind, proud of its precision, calls this understanding. Yet something breaks in that exchange. Something alive goes missing. The warmth drains from the moment like air from a punctured balloon, and what remains is a concept about life, not life itself. It happens during an ordinary morning. You're watching sunlight scatter on a glass of water, the ripples shimmering like quiet music. Then the thought arrives. How beautiful. The instant that thought solidifies, beauty turns into an idea rather than a vibration. The seeing becomes a mental picture, preserved but no longer breathing. That's the threshold, where comprehension quietly replaces presence. The human mind evolved to translate chaos into structure. It maps, names, and organizes, turning the infinite into something navigable. But this same brilliance creates a trap, the compulsion to grasp what can only be felt, the impulse to define what should be experienced. Comprehension is a kind of grasping hand, presence is an open palm. One takes, the other receives. Science itself illustrates this paradox. In quantum experiments, the act of measurement alters the very behavior of particles. The observer cannot remain outside the equation. The moment observation becomes interpretation. The field collapses into one of many potential outcomes. Similarly, in human perception, the moment you conceptualize what's happening, you're no longer meeting reality. You're meeting a record of it. Try this for a moment. Sit where you are and choose any small sensation. The hum of a refrigerator, the pressure of your feet on the floor, the faint pulse in your hands. Notice it without describing it. Don't even call it sensation. Just let it be what it is, wordless. Now, introduce a label. Sound, pressure, heartbeat. Instantly, the rawness becomes structured. The living wave of experience narrows into a cognitive box. That contraction, that tightening, is the exact point where comprehension steps in. Most of us confuse that contraction for clarity. We're taught that understanding equals control, that naming something means we've claimed it. But life isn't domesticated by intellect. The wildness of being, the pulse of an unrepeatable moment, resists definition. Presence has no summary. When comprehension replaces presence, we also replace uncertainty with illusion. The mind, unwilling to stand in mystery, manufactures narratives to feel safe. It says, I know what this is. Yet the cost of that safety is aliveness. To remain in presence is to accept a kind of trembling, an unshielded contact with what cannot be managed. It's vulnerability disguised as awareness. This is why truly attentive people seem to live in slow motion. They are not processing, they are participating. They don't need to interpret the movement of leaves or the tone in someone's voice. They feel the conversation between things before words arrive. Presence is not anti-intellectual. It's pre-intellectual. It's the soil from which true understanding eventually grows, not the act of comprehension itself. In art, in love, in nature, the same rule applies. The more you try to understand beauty, the further it retreats. A scientist can dissect a flower, mapping its genetic structure, but no diagram can carry the fragrance. The moment you think I know this, you've lost touch with the living presence that makes knowing possible. Here lies the quiet irony. Comprehension is useful for building systems, but fatal to direct experience. The most profound clarity doesn't arise from grasping, but from allowing. Presence reveals more through silence than thought can through description. The task is not to banish the mind, but to recognize when its need to know interrupts its ability to see. Tonight, as you move through your surroundings, notice when your attention switches from presence to comprehension. The shift has a physical signature, a slight tightening behind the eyes, a subtle inward lean toward analysis. When you catch it, pause, exhale. Let the mental grip loosen until the moment becomes fluid again. Reality doesn't vanish when you stop trying to understand it. It begins to reassemble itself. The warmth returns, the pulse resumes, and what was a concept becomes once again a living field. You realize that comprehension never replaced presence. It only borrowed its light. The moment you stop trying to hold the world, it holds you back. There is an old illusion embedded deep in the human nervous system. The belief that order comes from control. From the way we plan our days to the way we measure our worth, control feels like the stabilizing force that keeps chaos at bay. But beneath that psychological surface, reality plays by different rules. The quantum field, the invisible ocean of probability that underlies every atom, does not obey the logic of domination. It does not yield to pressure. In fact, it resists it. Physicists have long noted that at the subatomic level, control collapses potential. The more precisely you try to measure a particle's position, the less you can know about its momentum. The moment you fix one property, others dissolve into uncertainty. The field is telling us something ancient. The universe cannot be ruled, only related to. Reality doesn't need to be commanded. It responds to coherence, not coercion. You've felt this same law in your own body. Think of the times you've tried to force calmness during stress. The more you demanded peace from yourself, be still, relax, stop thinking, the more agitated you became. Control amplified the turbulence it wanted to silence. Yet when you softened your grip, when you stopped trying to manage the experience, calmness appeared by itself, not as obedience, but as resonance. The nervous system, like the quantum field, organizes through release, not domination. Try a small experiment right now. Sit quietly and choose something in your immediate environment, a sound, a flicker of light, or the texture of air on your skin. For a few seconds, attempt to control your perception of it. Tighten your attention, command yourself to notice it perfectly. Feel what happens inside your body, the narrowing, the stiffness, the slight aggression of focus. Now drop that command. Let perception happen without forcing it. The difference is immediate. The same moment becomes wider, softer, strangely intelligent. This is what the field feels like when you stop trying to own it. In quantum terms, every point in space is a potential event waiting for relational permission. When the observer demands certainty, the field collapses into a specific outcome. But when the observer remains open, neither grasping nor rejecting, the field stays alive, shimmering with possibilities. The paradox is that the less you try to steer reality, the more reality becomes navigable. The current carries you because you are no longer damming it. Control is rooted in fear. The mind fears uncertainty because it equates unpredictability with danger. Yet the quantum world shows us that uncertainty is not chaos. It's the raw material of creation. The field doesn't need to be mastered. It needs to be trusted. To control is to shrink infinite potential into one narrow line of expectation. To allow is to let intelligence reveal itself in real time. You can see this pattern in relationships, art, and even problem solving. The harder you try to force insight, the further it retreats. The moment you stop chasing it, clarity drifts in from the periphery. It's not laziness, it's alignment. The quantum field doesn't reward the mind that grasps. It responds to the mind that listens. Listening is the truest form of participation. Notice how modern culture celebrates control, productivity, precision, planning. These are useful tools, but when they become worldviews, they turn life into a predictable machine rather than a living process. The field is not a machine. It's a conversation, a constantly moving relationship between potential and attention. When attention becomes rigid, the conversation ends. When it stays curious, the dialogue deepens. There's a humility required to let go of control. It's not submission, it's cooperation with the invisible architecture of reality. The universe does not bend to commands, It synchronizes with coherence, and coherence arises when thought, emotion, and action stop fighting each other. That inner alignment acts like a tuning fork. It draws experiences that match its tone. You don't control the field, you attune to it. The next time something doesn't go according to plan, resist the instinct to tighten. Instead, pause and observe how your body reacts. The tension is a signal that the old reflex of control has been triggered. Take a slow breath, not to fix it, but to feel it. Let the field reorganize through your openness. Watch how, without a single strategic thought, solutions begin to surface, sometimes quietly, sometimes through coincidence, sometimes through someone else's words. The quantum field is not rejecting you, it is rejecting your insistence. It resists control because control breaks coherence. The deeper intelligence of the universe thrives in participation, not possession. Like water, it cannot be held, only entered. The more you try to contain it, the more it slips through your fingers. But once you trust its movement, it begins to carry you exactly where you were trying so hard to go. Reality's true stability comes not from control, but from communion. The field is waiting, not for mastery, but for resonance. The moment you surrender your need to steer it, the current reveals its own direction. What seemed random starts to form a pattern around your stillness. Control dissolves, coherence remains, and in that quiet alignment, the universe finally recognizes you as part of itself. Knowledge has always been the crown jewel of human evolution, the flame we guard, the proof of our ascent from instinct to intellect. But that same flame casts a shadow we rarely notice. The more intensely we seek to know, the more easily we lose contact with what is. The paradox of knowing is not that it blinds us to ignorance, but that it subtly replaces the living movement of experience with a static map of it. Logic, when overextended, freezes the current it tries to describe. Imagine standing beside a river. The water moves, reshaping itself every instant. You can measure its depth, analyze its current, and chart its speed, but the moment you define it, the river you described no longer exists. It has already changed form. The map was accurate for a heartbeat, and then it became outdated. Logic can only deal with what has already passed. Life, however, happens before logic can reach it. Human consciousness evolved as a tool for pattern recognition. It allowed us to predict weather, anticipate danger, and design civilization. But somewhere along the way, we began to worship prediction itself. We mistook clarity for truth. Logic became our filter for the real, and everything that couldn't be explained was quietly dismissed. The irony is that what gives life its vitality, the spontaneous, the ambiguous, the non-linear, exists precisely outside the reach of logic's net. You can observe this paradox in simple daily moments. Think of laughter. When you try to analyze why something is funny, the humor evaporates. Or consider intimacy. The moment you start dissecting why you feel close to someone, the closeness cools. The analytical mind divides what it touches, transforming participation into observation. Logic's strength is separation. Its weakness is the inability to reassemble what it has dissected. The collapse of the living flow under logic's gaze isn't a failure of intelligence, it's a limit of the instrument. Logic is a beautiful lens, but not a dwelling place. It allows you to understand the structure of a tree, but not the sensation of wind moving through its leaves. When you live entirely through reason, you exist in commentary rather than communion. You become the scientist of your own heartbeat, forgetting what it feels like to simply be alive. Try something now. Close your eyes and listen to a sound near you, the faint hum of a light, a passing car, your own breath. Without thinking about what it is, allow it to move through you. For a moment, don't categorize or interpret. Just receive. Now introduce a thought. That's my breath. Or, that's traffic outside. Instantly, the flow changes. What was movement becomes an object. This small shift demonstrates a cosmic principle. The act of naming collapses the mystery into definition. The paradox deepens when we realize that logic depends on duality. This versus that, true versus false, cause versus effect. But the living flow of reality is non-dual. It holds contradiction with ease. The ocean doesn't choose between calm and storm. It is both. Logic must choose sides. Life does not. When you try to apply binary reasoning to an organism made of infinite gradations, it starts to fragment. Yet this isn't an argument against logic. It's an invitation to see its proper role. Logic is a bridge, not the shore. It helps us navigate, but the destination is always beyond its reach. The most profound scientists, mystics, and artists have all encountered the same threshold, the recognition that beyond comprehension lies participation. Einstein himself admitted that the most beautiful experience is the mysterious, that which cannot be understood but only felt. We live in an age that prizes information, but information without reverence becomes noise. Knowledge without wonder becomes machinery. Logic, when detached from presence, loses its rhythm and turns brittle. The living flow, whether of nature, emotion, or consciousness, needs permeability, not precision. To truly know something alive, you must let it change you. There's a small test you can make today. When you find yourself trying to figure something out, why you feel off, why someone said what they did, pause. Notice the tightening behind your thoughts, the subtle urgency to reach a conclusion. Then, let that urgency dissolve. Instead of understanding the situation, feel it. Let perception breathe before it becomes language. Often what emerges is not an answer, but a kind of spacious clarity, something that logic could never construct but instantly recognizes as true. The paradox of knowing is that logic, in its desire to clarify, often distorts. It turns rivers into diagrams, people into categories, and living experiences into data points. But when we allow logic to bow to awareness, to serve rather than rule, it regains its beauty. It becomes a servant of the living flow rather than its warden. Real intelligence is not the mastery of knowledge, but the humility to let mystery coexist with understanding. When logic releases its grip, the flow resumes, fresh, unpredictable, alive. In that moment, knowing and not knowing dance as one, and the mind for once stops collapsing reality and starts belonging to it. There's a strange phenomenon that every deep observer eventually encounters. The moment you start analyzing reality, it begins to withdraw. It's as if the universe, so willing to reveal itself to an open gaze, suddenly grows shy under the spotlight of scrutiny. The more you chase it with intellect, the more it slips behind the curtain. Like a wild animal sensing the trap of attention, it retreats into stillness, leaving only traces of where it once moved freely. You've probably experienced this in subtle ways. Think of trying to recall a dream. The harder you concentrate, the faster it dissolves. Or when you try to remember the name that sits on the tip of your tongue, it hides precisely because you're trying. The universe behaves with the same paradoxical intelligence. When met with genuine curiosity, it unfolds. When met with analysis alone, it closes its petals. This isn't because analysis is wrong, it's because analysis divides. To analyze means to separate a whole into its parts, to freeze motion long enough to dissect it. But reality isn't composed of parts, it's a single continuous event. When you cut it apart to understand it, you interrupt its coherence. The act of examination changes the very subject being examined. Quantum physics offers a mirror of this truth. The observer effect shows that the more precisely you measure one aspect of a system, the more the rest becomes uncertain. The observation itself changes the field. Imagine standing before a vast night sky. At first you just look. The stars shimmer, the silence expands, and something in you feels immense. Then the mind begins its commentary, naming constellations, recalling distances, calculating light years. The cosmic mystery turns into an equation. You haven't lost the stars, but you've lost the presence of them. They've turned into data points instead of messengers. The universe hides, not because it's withholding secrets, but because you've replaced intimacy with inquiry. There's a deeper law at work here. Reality responds to the quality of attention it receives. When attention is tight, mechanical, goal-oriented, the world mirrors that rigidity. But when attention is soft, receptive, unhurried, the world opens like water around a hand. The difference isn't in the universe, it's in the observer's state of being. Try an experiment in perception. Look at a simple object near you, a leaf, a cup, a shadow. First, analyze it, its color, shape, texture, the logic of its design. Notice the mental activity, the inner commentary, the quick comparisons, the attempt to define. Then stop, drop the language, and simply see. Let your gaze become silent. After a few seconds, you may notice something subtle. The object seems to regain depth, presence, even a quiet aliveness. You've stopped looking at it and started seeing with it. The universe is always available at that level, just beyond the reach of analysis. In this sense, hiding is not rejection, it's protection. The universe shields its essence from minds that would turn it into a formula. What hides is the living intelligence that cannot be trapped in concept. Analysis can map the outer structure, but never the inner pulse. That pulse reveals itself only through communion, through direct participation. This is why sacred moments, those brief flashes of awe or peace, vanish the moment we try to explain them. The intellect, eager to understand, unknowingly dismantles what it wishes to preserve. It's like trying to capture music by freezing a sound wave. The form remains, but the song is gone. The universe doesn't punish analysis. It just can't survive in its atmosphere. And yet, this dance of hiding has a purpose. It teaches us humility. The universe withdraws not to frustrate us, but to remind us that mystery is a living force, not a puzzle to be solved. What we call hidden is simply what doesn't fit within the frame of our comprehension. The universe hides until we learn how to see without trying to own the view. There's a profound freedom in this realization. You don't need to chase the truth. It's not running away. It's simply waiting for the noise of analysis to quiet down. When that happens, what was hidden begins to glow again in ordinary places. In a breath, a reflection, a passing glance. You notice that the world never disappeared. It was only veiled by the mind's insistence on control. Tonight, if you find yourself analyzing something, your feelings, your future, even this very moment, pause. Let the analysis unwind. Step back into simple perception. Feel how the world subtly reappears when you stop trying to define it. The hidden returns not because you found it, but because you've stopped chasing it away. The universe hides when analyzed because life refuses to be turned into an object. It is both seen and seer, both question and answer. When you surrender the need to dissect it, you become transparent enough for it to pass through you again. And in that silent exchange, when you're no longer trying to understand, the universe no longer hides. It breathes. There is a quiet break that happens the moment awareness turns inward and realizes it is watching itself. It's not a physical break, but a subtle split, a fracture between the one who experiences and the one who observes the experience. This is the birth of the observer's fracture, the tension between living and witnessing life. For most people, it starts so early that it becomes invisible, like a crack beneath polished glass. We move through our days slightly divided, always a few inches away from the immediacy of existence. The mind learned to survive by watching, predicting, and analyzing. Observation became its shield. By standing apart from events, it could calculate, prepare, and avoid harm. But the same ability that protects also isolates. When you become the observer of your own life for too long, you lose the warmth of participation. You start to watch yourself living instead of simply living. The inner dialogue becomes the narrator of every scene, commenting, comparing, correcting. Eventually, the narration grows louder than the scene itself. That's the fracture, the separation between being and observing being. In spiritual traditions, this distance has two faces. One is sacred, the space that allows self-awareness, compassion, and choice. The other is tragic, the constant self-monitoring that erodes spontaneity. Like a double exposure in an old photograph, the observer and the observed blur into one uneasy image. You can feel this fracture in the small hesitations of everyday life. When you're laughing but also aware that you're laughing. When you feel love but are simultaneously evaluating it. When you speak but hear your own tone and wonder if it sounds authentic. It's a kind of internal echo, life happening twice, once in reality and once in review. The observer's fracture steals immediacy and replaces it with commentary. For a moment, imagine turning off that commentary. No self-narration, no assessment, no inner camera recording what you do. What remains? At first, it feels like falling. Then, almost instantly, something deep relaxes. Breath flows more easily. The senses sharpen. The world regains depth and dimension. Without the internal spectator, you are once again within the scene, not standing outside of it. This experiment reveals how much energy the fracture consumes. Self-observation, when constant, becomes a leak in consciousness. The energy meant for connection is diverted into evaluation. The mind, obsessed with how it appears, loses touch with what it truly is. You end up managing impressions rather than living experiences. Science, too, hints at this paradox. In quantum theory, the observer influences the outcome of what is measured, but only by collapsing probabilities into a single state. Consciousness, in trying to know, changes what it observes. The observer's fracture works similarly within us. The act of overwatching collapses the living spectrum of possibility into a fixed version of self. The more you monitor who you are, the smaller you become. Healing the fracture doesn't mean losing awareness. It means restoring flow between awareness and experience. It's not about erasing the observer, but teaching it to dissolve back into participation. There's a difference between seeing and watching. Seeing is fluid, connected, intimate. Watching is cautious, distant, defensive. When you truly see, the boundary between you and what is seen becomes porous. The fracture mends itself through intimacy with the moment. You can test this right now. Choose a simple act: drinking water, touching your hand to your chest, listening to a sound. Do it as you normally would, with the faint hum of self-awareness running in the background. Then, on purpose, release the watcher. Let the doing happen without the one doing it. The action completes itself. The sensation deepens. For a few seconds, you're whole again. No split, no observer, just pure movement. This is what the fracture hides from you, the immediacy of existence. The more you try to observe yourself into wholeness, the further you drift from it. Wholeness is not achieved through surveillance, it's remembered through surrender. The moment you stop monitoring who you are, reality meets you directly without distortion. The observer's fracture is not an error of consciousness, it's a stage of evolution. Awareness learned to separate itself so that it could recognize itself. But now, a deeper phase begins. Awareness learning to rejoin what it observes without losing clarity. Integration is the next step. Seeing without splitting, knowing without leaving. If these words resonate, take a quiet breath and let that inner observer rest for just a moment. Notice what happens when you stop narrating and start inhabiting this instant fully. That simple shift is where healing begins. And before you go, I'd love to hear something real from you, not analysis, not theory. Write one sentence in the comments about a moment when you felt truly present, even for a second. Describe it as simply as you can. Let it be your mark of wholeness, a small reminder that the fracture can always mend itself the moment you stop trying to watch it heal. There comes a point when the mind, exhausted by its own explanations, simply stops. Not out of defeat, but out of recognition. Recognition that comprehension has reached the limit of what it can hold. In that pause, something extraordinary begins to happen. Reality starts to mend itself. What was fragmented by thought begins to reassemble, not through insight but through stillness. Understanding pauses, and in that silence, life repairs what the mind had unknowingly torn apart. We spend so much of our existence trying to make sense of things, our past, our emotions, our relationships, the universe itself. We chase patterns and reasons, believing that if we can just understand, peace will follow. But peace rarely comes through understanding. It comes when understanding stops demanding to lead. Healing doesn't enter through logic, it enters through surrender. You can see this process in the natural world. When a forest burns, the land doesn't analyze its loss. It rests, ash settles, silence reigns. And slowly, without instruction, new shoots appear through the soot. Life reorganizes itself from within, guided by an intelligence that doesn't need explanation. The same is true of consciousness. When we stop forcing meaning onto our experience, our inner terrain begins to regrow. The need to understand everything is a disguised form of control. It's the mind's way of saying, I will not rest until the world behaves according to my logic. But the world is not logical, it's coherent. Coherence is different from control. It's the quiet rhythm that arises when things align without being managed. When we stop trying to fit everything into a narrative, that deeper coherence begins to reveal itself. Try a small experiment. Think of something in your life that feels unresolved. Perhaps a tension, a question, a repeated pattern. Notice the impulse to analyze it, to trace its cause, to frame it in language, to solve it. Then consciously drop the need to know. Sit inside the question without chasing the answer. You may feel discomfort at first. The mind hates open loops, but soon a subtle shift occurs. The energy that was once locked in thought starts to breathe again. The situation itself begins to move toward balance, often without your intervention. This is not mysticism, it's the natural rhythm of intelligence. Every system, when not interfered with, tends toward equilibrium. The same is true for awareness. The more we meddle with endless interpretation, the more we disturb that self-healing capacity. Understanding is valuable, but it must know when to step aside. Too much comprehension is like overwatering a plant. It drowns the roots that could have nourished growth. There is also a physical dimension to this truth. When you stop trying to understand your emotions, the body relaxes, muscles release, breathing deepens, the nervous system recalibrates. The physiology of surrender is real. The moment comprehension loosens its grip, energy that was frozen in analysis starts to flow again. Healing, in its most basic form, is the return of flow. This is why certain insights only come after we give up on finding them. When the mind stops chasing clarity, clarity sneaks in through the back door. It's not born of effort but of openness. The same intelligence that runs the stars runs through you. It doesn't need your conclusions, it needs your cooperation. Understanding can map the terrain. Surrender lets the terrain restore itself. The irony is that the deeper you move into unknowing, the more life begins to make sense on its own terms. Things start aligning in quiet ways. Conversations, coincidences, inner signals. They don't answer your questions directly. They dissolve the need for questions. What once felt broken starts to function again, not because you solved it, but because you stopped interrupting the repair. When understanding stops, reality reclaims its own intelligence. The self you were trying to fix becomes transparent, and through it, life begins to act freely. Healing is not something you achieve. It's what remains when interference ceases. There's a kind of intelligence in not knowing that the mind cannot replicate. It's not ignorance, it's intimacy. It trusts that reality, left unprodded, knows how to organize itself. The human heart follows the same principle. When you stop trying to interpret every emotion, the heart finds its own rhythm again. The ache softens, the breath deepens. To stop understanding doesn't mean to abandon reflection. It means to sense the moment when reflection turns into resistance, and to let that moment go. In that gesture, you return to participation rather than observation. You're no longer a thinker looking at life from a distance. You're part of the unfolding itself. When understanding stops, reality heals because it finally has room to breathe. The fragments of perception start aligning again, like glass melting back into wholeness under heat. The truth was never missing. It was simply buried under interpretation. And once the noise of knowing quiets, what remains is the simple, wordless coherence of being alive. To the ordinary mind, not knowing feels like failure. From childhood, we are trained to value certainty, to have answers, to form opinions, to define and defend them. Yet beneath all the noise of conclusions, there exists a quieter intelligence, one that doesn't rush to decide. This is the wisdom of not knowing, a presence that doesn't cling to meaning, but allows life to speak in its own unfinished language. Not knowing isn't ignorance. Ignorance resists learning. Not knowing is the doorway through which genuine learning enters. It's the humility that precedes discovery, the silence before insight forms. The greatest scientists, mystics, and artists have all known this state intimately. It's what Einstein meant when he said, "The most beautiful thing we can experience is the mysterious." Not knowing is not the absence of understanding. It's the fertile ground from which true understanding grows. When you don't know, your senses sharpen. You listen differently. You see without the filter of expectation. The world ceases to be a repetition of what you've already labeled and becomes raw again, alive, unpredictable, unfinished. The mind, freed from its usual compulsion to name and control, begins to participate rather than dictate. And in that participation, something ancient awakens, a deep intelligence that doesn't need to know in order to respond. Think about the moments in your life when clarity came uninvited, when you weren't thinking your way toward it, but rather stumbled upon it in stillness or surrender. Perhaps it arrived while walking, staring at the sky, or washing your hands. The mind wasn't strategizing, and yet understanding appeared unforced. That's the paradox of not knowing. When you no longer chase answers, life begins to hand them to you in forms you didn't expect. The modern world mistrusts this kind of intelligence. It rewards speed, accuracy, and data. Yet every deep process, healing, creativity, relationship, requires time spent in uncertainty. Seeds germinate in darkness, not under constant scrutiny. A child learns language by immersion, not by dissecting grammar. The mind, when softened into not knowing, regains the natural rhythm of life itself. There's a physical sensation to this state. When you stop insisting on answers, the body loosens, the forehead relaxes, the breath deepens. A quiet spaciousness opens inside you. This is not passivity, it's readiness. In not knowing, you're no longer braced against life's unfolding. You've stopped trying to manage the script and begun to trust the improvisation. Try this small practice. Take a situation that troubles you, something unresolved or unclear. Notice the thoughts that rush in to explain, predict, or categorize it. Then, for a few minutes, deliberately let go of every explanation. Feel what remains when the mind doesn't know what to do. At first, there's restlessness, a mental itch to fill the space. But beneath that, if you wait long enough, there's peace. A sense that the situation is already held by a larger intelligence that doesn't depend on your interpretation. Not knowing reintroduces wonder. It dissolves the illusion that reality must fit our definitions. When you live through not knowing, the world becomes participatory again. Each moment an unanswered question that invites your attention rather than your control. You begin to notice coincidences, subtle alignments, a language of synchronicity, whispering beneath ordinary events. These are not proofs, they are invitations. Life starts to feel like a dialogue rather than a riddle. There's also a moral clarity that emerges from not knowing. When you stop pretending to understand others completely, compassion becomes natural. You realize that everyone, no matter how certain they sound, is navigating mystery. To not know someone fully is to allow them their freedom, to let them be unfinished just as you are. The wisdom of not knowing is inherently kind. It softens judgment because it sees that the story is still being written. In deep silence, not knowing turns luminous. It's not empty, it's full of possibility. Each moment, unclaimed by explanation, carries infinite potential. The mind wants to close the circle, but not knowing keeps it open. And in that openness, creativity thrives. Every act of innovation, every leap of intuition begins in this space. When we surrender to not knowing, we return to the source of awareness itself, the place before thought, before opinion, before language divides experience into this and that. It is the state children live in before they learn to name the world. They don't see a tree. They see movement, color, texture, sound. Their gaze is whole because it hasn't yet fractured into knowing. Eventually, understanding will return as it always does, but it will come as a guest, not a ruler. The mind will learn to bow to the mystery rather than to cage it. And in that balance between knowing and not knowing, life regains its depth. The wisdom of not knowing is not a rejection of knowledge, it is its completion. It reminds us that beneath every answer lies another question, and beneath every question, an infinite silence waiting to speak again. In that silence, reality stops needing to be explained and begins to be felt. That is where wisdom begins, not in what we know, but in our willingness to remain awake inside what we don't. Most of us were taught to see by separating ourselves from what we look at. We were told that clear vision requires distance, that objectivity means stepping back. But there is another way of seeing, one that doesn't divide. It's a way of perceiving that holds the world gently, without breaking it apart to understand it. To see without breaking is to perceive without invasion, to let reality remain whole while it reveals itself. You can feel the difference in your body. When you look at something analytically, the gaze sharpens, the muscles around the eyes tighten, the attention narrows like a spotlight. The mind begins to calculate, compare, define. But when you look without breaking, your gaze softens. It becomes more like listening than inspecting. There's no need to control the image. Instead of looking at something, you begin to see with it. You share in its presence rather than dissecting it. This shift might sound subtle, but it changes the entire texture of perception. In conventional seeing, the observer stands apart, and the world becomes an object, a thing to be categorized, owned, or used. In unbroken seeing, the observer and the observed share the same field of awareness. The boundary between subject and object blurs, not into confusion, but into intimacy. You realize that to see something truly, you must let it remain what it is. The scientist and the mystic both encounter this truth, though they name it differently. In physics, every attempt to pin down the smallest constituents of reality changes them. The observer effect is not an accident. It is a law that says observation alters the observed. The universe doesn't tolerate forceful seeing. When perception turns intrusive, it collapses what it touches. But when observation is open, coherent, and non-invasive, the system responds in kind. Reality discloses itself to the quality of attention it receives. Seeing without breaking is a form of communion. It's what happens when a painter looks at light, not as an object to be copied, but as a partner in conversation. It's what occurs when a person listens to another without preparing a response. In those moments, perception is no longer extraction. It's participation. What you see reveals itself to the degree that you stop trying to capture it. Try this small exercise. Choose a familiar object, a book, a leaf, a glass of water. Look at it as you normally do, identifying its color, purpose, history. Then, without changing your position, allow the act of seeing to soften. Let your breath widen. Don't aim to understand the object. Let it rest in your awareness without commentary. After a few moments, something subtle shifts. The object begins to feel less inert. Its presence grows denser, more alive, almost relational. You are no longer the observer, you are the space in which seeing happens. This is what it means to see without breaking, to perceive without interference. The ego's impulse to grasp, to define, to declare I know begins to fade. In its place appears a quiet intimacy that doesn't need words. You begin to sense that every form, stone, body, sound, is held by a single continuity of being. The divisions that analysis creates are replaced by coherence. The world seen in this way stops fragmenting under the weight of your attention. When we look through the lens of judgment or control, the world reflects those fractures back to us. Every attempt to dominate reality makes it defensive, opaque. But when we approach perception as presence, the world responds with transparency. It's as if reality wants to be seen but not interrogated. It opens only to those who can hold its gaze without demanding an explanation. This kind of seeing also transforms relationships. When you look at another person without trying to read, fix, or evaluate them, something miraculous happens. They begin to soften. They feel seen, not assessed. Your awareness stops being a mirror that reflects judgment and becomes a space that allows them to exist. True connection is born not from understanding, but from this unbroken perception. Seeing without breaking doesn't mean blindness to detail. It means seeing detail without losing the whole. It means being able to recognize patterns without turning them into prisons. The analytical mind slices reality into parts. Coherent seeing holds those parts together without dissolving their uniqueness. This is how life heals from fragmentation, through perception that neither clings nor cuts. In a quiet sense, this is also how the universe sees itself. The act of awareness, when unbroken, mirrors the fundamental coherence of existence. The cosmos is not a machine of separate components. It's a field of mutual observation. To see without breaking is to align your perception with that cosmic rhythm, to look as life looks, without violence, without demand. There is an intelligence in gentleness. The more softly you see, the more reality shows you. It doesn't need to be forced open, it only needs to be trusted. Every time you resist the urge to interpret, you let existence remain intact. And in that intactness, truth reveals itself. Seeing without breaking is not an act of perception, it's an act of reverence. It's the moment when your gaze becomes a bridge rather than a blade. There is a turning point in awareness, when the observer and the observed no longer stand apart. It doesn't arrive through effort or theory, but through the slow mending of attention. After all the seeing, analyzing, and surrendering, something begins to reassemble inside. The observer becomes whole again. The fracture that once separated self from experience dissolves, and what remains is a steady clarity that watches without dividing. This is integration, the quiet art of becoming the unbroken observer. Integration isn't an achievement, it's a return. The mind doesn't climb toward it, it relaxes into it. Imagine a mirror that for years believed its reflections were its identity. It learned to prefer some images and reject others, calling them me and not me. But one day, it notices something startling. The mirror itself was never touched by what it reflected. Scratches appeared only on the surface of attention, never on the awareness beneath. Integration begins with that recognition, that seeing and being seen happen within the same field, and the observer has always been part of what it observes. In practical terms, integration is a shift from control to coherence. The unbroken observer doesn't manage experience, it receives it. The chaos of thought, emotion, and perception no longer feels like a battlefield to organize, but like a symphony that plays through one instrument. Conflict doesn't vanish. It harmonizes. The observer no longer chooses sides between mind and body, inner and outer, self and other. It recognizes that these divisions were never more than momentary distortions in perception. To live as an unbroken observer is to experience continuity across change. You can feel sadness without collapsing into it, joy without clutching it, confusion without demanding resolution. Awareness holds them all, like a sky that doesn't resist the weather passing through it. The self, once busy identifying with every cloud, now remembers it is the space that allows them all. This remembering doesn't numb you, it intensifies aliveness. The less you resist experience, the more vivid life becomes. The process of integration has physical markers too. The nervous system starts to mirror the state of inner coherence. Breathing deepens, the jaw softens, and small unconscious tensions release. Presence begins to spread through the body like warmth, returning to cold limbs. You're not escaping thought or emotion. You're allowing them to move through a wider field of awareness. The unbroken observer is embodied, not detached, but deeply rooted in the sensations of now. Integration also changes how time is felt. When awareness is divided, time feels fragmented. Moments rush or stall depending on your resistance to them. But when the observer is whole, time loses its edge. Each moment stands complete, neither part of a chase nor an escape. You experience continuity instead of progression. This is why integrated awareness often feels timeless. It doesn't erase time, it stops being chased by it. There's a humility in this way of seeing. The unbroken observer doesn't claim special insight or superiority. It recognizes that wholeness isn't a personal possession. It's the natural state of awareness when interference ceases. Integration doesn't make you more enlightened, it makes you more human. You become porous again, capable of being touched by life without losing your center. Think of this integration as a kind of restoration, the way a cracked vessel can be repaired with gold, as in the Japanese art of kintsugi. The golden seams don't hide the break, they honor it. Each crack becomes part of the design, proof that separation once occurred and was lovingly mended. Similarly, integration doesn't erase the observer's fracture, it includes it. The very act of noticing separation becomes part of wholeness. This restoration also transforms how you perceive others. When you meet someone from the state of the unbroken observer, you no longer see them as objects of interpretation. You see them as extensions of the same awareness. Their gestures, their words, even their contradictions, all move within the same living field that you inhabit. Judgment softens, not because you adopt a moral position of kindness, but because separation itself loses credibility. Integration is not a static condition, it's a rhythm. There will still be moments when you slip back into fragmentation, when the old habits of control return. But each time you remember to observe without splitting, the movement toward wholeness strengthens. Over time, the returning becomes effortless. The boundaries between inner and outer blur until perception feels like one continuous gesture, awareness breathing itself. To become the unbroken observer is to rediscover intimacy with existence. You realize that you were never outside the scene, never merely watching the play. You were the stage, the actors, the light, and the audience all along. Observation becomes participation again, but this time with full consciousness. The world doesn't need to be understood or managed. It only needs to be seen through the eyes of wholeness. When seeing is whole, everything aligns. Thought becomes quieter, not because it's suppressed, but because it finds its right place in the greater coherence of awareness. Emotion becomes fluid rather than dramatic. Even silence feels alive. You move through the world as part of its pulse, not as a separate witness of it. This is the heart of integration, the moment when observation and existence finally recognize each other as one continuous act of being. When the search for certainty exhausts itself, when even the finest explanations begin to sound hollow, something ancient and luminous starts to stir beneath the noise of comprehension. That stirring is the call of the living mystery, the pulse of existence before it is turned into meaning. Every path of observation, every fracture, every surrender leads back here, to the recognition that reality was never meant to be solved, only experienced in full awareness. The return to the living mystery is not a retreat from knowledge, but a reunion with the intelligence that moves before knowledge begins. Mystery has never been absent. It is the invisible fabric through which all things move. We lost sight of it not because it withdrew, but because we trained ourselves to look only for what could be named. Yet beneath the grid of definitions, life keeps whispering in untranslatable rhythms. Every breath, every coincidence, every silence between thoughts is a small aperture, through which the vastness peers in. The return begins the moment you stop asking life to fit within your understanding and start allowing your understanding to dissolve into life. To live in mystery is not to abandon reason, but to let reason rest inside a larger field of wonder. When you stop insisting on clarity, the world stops shrinking. The edges of things soften. The ordinary grows radiant. A leaf is no longer just a leaf. It's a living junction of water, sunlight, and unseen intelligence. The familiar begins to glow again, as if you're seeing the world for the first time, because in a sense, you are. Mystery doesn't change what you see, it changes how you see. There's a humility required for this return. The intellect, after years of dominance, has to admit that its brilliance was never meant to replace awe. It can explain patterns, but not the pulse that animates them. It can model behavior, but not the meaning of being. When the mind bows to that limit, it doesn't lose power. It gains depth. Mystery re-enters perception, and knowledge becomes luminous again, no longer brittle or defensive. Imagine standing at the edge of the sea at night. The horizon is gone. The sky and water blend into one infinite presence. You can't tell where one ends and the other begins. You could analyze the waves, their chemistry, their physics, but at that moment, analysis feels like an intrusion. What moves through you is not understanding but belonging. That's the living mystery touching you, the recognition that you are made of the same depth you are looking into. Mystery is not opposed to science or logic. It is what makes both possible. Every discovery begins in wonder. Every act of genuine inquiry arises from the question that refuses to die. When you return to that source, you realize that the unknown isn't something to overcome. It's the field that keeps creation alive. The world doesn't need to be decoded, it needs to be met. This return also mends the sense of exile many people feel from their own existence. Modern life trains us to live on the surface, where data replaces intimacy and explanation substitutes for direct experience. But beneath that surface, life remains vivid and untamed, waiting for a quieter kind of attention. When you step back into the living mystery, You stop trying to manage reality and begin to cooperate with it. Your awareness shifts from directing life to being carried by it. In that participation, perception becomes fluid again. You stop asking what things mean and start feeling what they are. Even confusion feels sacred when held inside this kind of seeing. You don't need to interpret every sensation or reconcile every paradox. Mystery welcomes contradiction. It breathes through it. You start to sense that life's apparent opposites, creation and destruction, light and shadow, birth and decay, are simply alternating notes in one continuous song. The return to the living mystery is also a return to intimacy with the present. Each moment, when stripped of assumption, contains a kind of quiet infinity. You begin to taste the immediacy that children live in before their minds divide the world into categories. The air, the sound of footsteps, the pause between words, all of it becomes evidence of something immeasurable. Mystery isn't distant. It's embedded in the texture of every second. This way of living doesn't offer safety, but it offers wholeness. The unbroken observer finds peace not in control, but in participation. The need to know yields to the willingness to feel. Life becomes less about answers and more about responsiveness. The smallest event, a flicker of light, a shared glance, a moment of silence, feels complete because you're no longer seeking the meaning beyond it. You're standing inside the meaning itself. The return to the living mystery is not a final stage. It's the ongoing movement of consciousness, remembering its source. Every breath can be a homecoming, every perception a reintroduction to the unspeakable depth of being. When you live from that recognition, the world ceases to be an object in front of you and becomes a dialogue you're already part of. Mystery doesn't ask to be known, it asks to be met. And when you meet it without breaking it apart, you discover what the universe was trying to show you all along, that you were never separate from it, only looking the other way. Reality never truly hides, it only waits for the observer to soften. When comprehension gives way to presence, when control yields to coherence, the world becomes whole again. What began as an inquiry into perception ends as a quiet reunion with what has always been here. The living mystery breathing through every thought, every silence, every heartbeat. The observer and the observed are no longer two. They are a single act of awareness unfolding itself endlessly. If you've arrived here, you've walked through the full circle of seeing, questioning, and remembering. To let me know you reached this moment, write the words, "I'm still here, inside the mystery," in the comments. And if this journey spoke to something in you, stay with that resonance. Watch one of the videos appearing on your screen now. Each one continues this conversation with reality, not as theory, but as lived awareness.